Way greetings, relatives. My name is Roberto Mucaro Borrero, and I'm going to be serving as your host today and also a trainer as part of this special uh, co-collaboration, this training program in advance of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Just allow me just one moment to bring some slides up here and we can begin. For those who are tuning in, what we want you to know is that there is an interpretation. There is interpretation available today. You just need to click on your interpretation icon and pick the language that you wish to hear the presentations in. Again, go down to the bottom of your screen, find the interpretation icon, which looks like a little globe. Select that, and you can select the language you wish to hear the presentation in. So once again, this training session is based on Project Access Indigenous Partnerships training program, Indigenous peoples in the international system. Just a little bit of history. Project Access began back in 2006 as a global capacity building workshop for Indigenous peoples. And it was developed in collaboration with Indigenous leaders by the founding visionary executive director who passed away recently, Pamela Kraft. In 2023, the Indigenous co-creators, trainers, alumni are now steering the Project Access into a new phase led by Indigenous peoples. And we're going to continue to center on Indigenous power building via training sessions, consultations, partnerships, and resource sharing. So we welcome you and welcome all of our partners. I just want to introduce our trainers for today. We have Andrea Carmen of the Yaqui Nation. She's the executive director of the International Indian Treaty Council, who is also one of the co-organizers today. And I apologize that we didn't have the Treaty Council logo on the flyer. Also, Rochelle Diver from the Anishinaabe Nation. She also works with International Indian Treaty Council in the Environmental Health Program. And of course, myself, my name is Roberto Mucaro Borrero. I'm a member of the Wainea Taino tribe, also working with IITC and Project Access Indigenous Partnership as well. So what you can expect today, one, I mentioned the interpretation feature already. So again, pick the icon and your desired language. And if you would like to comment or ask questions, you can do so via the Q&A function that's also found at the bottom of your screen, or you can do so via the chat function, and we'll get those comments. So the agenda for today, part one, is about 1.5 hours. This is European time that you'll see in the agenda here. But in the beginning, you'll have this intro and also a discussion on Indigenous peoples in the international system. This is to kind of set the context for what you're coming into with the Permanent Forum. Following that presentation, there'll be a focus on the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues. Andrea Carmen will lead that. And then following that presentation, we'll go to part two, which will be focused on making an intervention at the United Nations Permanent Forum. Finally, following that, we'll have a homework assignment for some of you who will be actually attending the forum. And in closing, we'll have Morse coming in from the UN Voluntary Fund to speak a little bit about that and as one of the main co-sponsors for today. So the training workshop goals that we have here, some of the highlights, is one is to gain a deeper understanding of the impact of Indigenous peoples at the United Nations. Two, hopefully you'll better understand how to navigate the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, as well as some other key UN platforms. The Permanent Forum is not the only place to engage, and you'll learn a little bit more about that as we go along. Number three, hopefully you'll gain some skills to more effectively engage at the Permanent Forum as part of your overall advocacy strategy. So what we mean by this is that the Permanent Forum shouldn't be seen in isolation. It should be seen as part of a system and part of your overall strategy for the advancement of the rights of your peoples and communities. And finally, another highlight and outcome, we hope that with this introductory training that you'll be receiving today, that you'll be joining a wider community of practice committed to similar goals. In other words, you'll be connecting to a larger international Indigenous peoples network fighting for the recognition and respect of our basic human rights. Now, some of the learning objectives that you have is one, to become more familiar with the history of the Indigenous peoples movement for recognition at the United Nations. Also to understand the mandate and the processes of the Permanent Forum, as well as be prepared to make a more effective intervention during the session. And finally, to gain an introductory knowledge of other entry points for Indigenous peoples within the UN system. So with that, I'm going to end this brief intro. And I want to end by thanking all the co-sponsors, the co-organizers of the event, Equator Initiative, Tero, UNDP. Of course, I mentioned already the International Indian Treaty Council, International Service for Human Rights, International Indigenous Peoples Rights International, and of course, Project Access Indigenous Partnership. So I'm going to stop the screen share, and I will bring up another presentation. So please just a moment of your patience while I do that. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you for your patience. And we're going to begin with this presentation, Indigenous Peoples in the International System. And I start with this photo here so that you can understand, where you can go in this process. I'm just like everyone else, an advocate, a community member, and I came into this process to raise the visibility of the issues for our people. And you can, attain and engage at a very high level if you continue to stick with the process. So where we begin for this session and for this segment here, we're going to begin with who are Indigenous peoples. And this is important because the focus today obviously is to better engage the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues. One thing I want to point out is that there's no universal legal definition of Indigenous peoples. However, there are recognized working definitions. For example, UNDESA states that Indigenous peoples are inheritors and practitioners of unique cultures and ways of relating to people and the environment. They have retained social, cultural, and economic and political characteristics that are distinct from those of the dominant societies in which they live. So it's also noted that while there are cultural differences, Indigenous peoples from all around the world share common problems related to the protection of their rights as distinct peoples. And finally, I'll say that Indigenous peoples are distinct from local communities and minorities. And we'll get a little bit into that a little bit more as we go along, but you'll see a little bit more what I'm talking about as we move further into the presentation. So here's a question for everyone. Why bring our issues to the international fora? If you come from an Indigenous peoples community, you understand the situation that we have, that we face as Indigenous peoples, and historically, traditionally, and up to today. And a lot of that is centered around and has to do with the violation of our basic human rights. And so this idea that sometimes this understanding that sometimes we as Indigenous peoples, leadership, community, etc., understands that we don't see the restitution or the resolution of these challenges at the local or national level. And so we continue to fight and struggle. So we have to, at some point, come to the realization that we need to bring and raise the visibility of our issues outside to enlist additional support and bring these issues up to really fight for the dignity of who we are as peoples. So this is not a new concept, and actually two Indigenous leaders in the 1920s actually had this idea, and they took this particular route, moving. They felt that they exhausted their national remedies, and that the only option that they had was to take their situation to the international forum. At that time, it was the League of Nations. The United Nations was not even yet established. So in 1923, Haudenosaunee chief Diskahe traveled to the League of Nations to defend the right of his people to live under their own laws, on their own land, and under their own faith. Similarly, in 1925, Maori religious leader T.W. Ratana also went to the League of Nations to protest the breaking of the Treaty of Waitangi that was concluded between the Maori and the settler government in Aotearoa, or what we know today as New Zealand. What's interesting to point out here is that these two leaders, coming from two different sides of the globe, did not confer in advance, but they came to the same conclusion that they needed to take their issues beyond what they were dealing with at the national level and need to take it to the international level. And it's similar to what Malcolm X had come to a realization at some point, where he says that we're not fighting for civil rights, we're really fighting for human rights. So this was in 1923, League of Nations. What happens after that? You have the establishment of the United Nations in 1945. That's following the World War II. The UN is made up of 193 member states. You know, it is their house, and their work is guided by the purposes and principles that are contained in its founding charter. And we might touch on that a little bit more. But one of the basic aims of the UN, as noted in the charter, is to promote and encourage the respect for human rights and the fundamental freedoms for all, without discrimination as to race, sex, language, or religion. And that's very important because you remember what was happening in World War II, what people were fighting against, fascism and brutal discrimination. And so this is why the UN was formed. And so it seems like the appropriate place for us to take our issues. The main bodies of the UN are the UN General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the Trusteeship Council, the International Court of Justice, and the UN Secretariat. But primarily in this discussion, we'll be focusing on what happens under the Economic and Social Council. But under the GA, there is also opportunities to engage in its subsidiary bodies, mechanisms, and processes. So following that 1945, you really don't hear much about Indigenous peoples in the international system. But around the 1960s and 1970s, you have a rise of what they call the power movements. Some of you might have heard the term Black Power, Red Power, for example. And there's a series of activities that are going on, such as in the United States and elsewhere. But highlighting a few here that are very significant. There's the occupation of Alcatraz Island, 1969. There's a Trail of Broken Treaties, in 1972, and also the extradition of Leonard Peltier in 1976. And a lot of this engagement and activity is really initiated and undertaken by the American Indian movement. Out of that movement, you have the birth of the International Indian Treaty Council, one of our co-sponsors for today, that came together after indigenous peoples from North, Central, South America came together and decided that they too needed to take their issues beyond the national level to the international level to raise that visibility and call for the recognition of their human rights as peoples. So you'll hear this term a lot when you're at the United Nations, when you're engaging in issues, especially when you're talking about indigenous peoples. This term is collective rights. And collective rights are human rights that basically protect peoples, communities, and the environment. So after civil and political rights, these are known as first generation rights. Social, economic, and cultural rights, those are second generation rights. Collective rights are included in what they call third generation or solidarity rights. And what's important to note here that they are universal, indivisible, and interdependent. So protecting the collective rights, we guarantee preservation of cultural identities, forms of organization, and traditional heritage. And it also allows communities of indigenous peoples to continue practicing community forest management, for example, agroecology, traditional practices, and all of which contribute to global sustainability, making a better world, in other words. So in 1977, the UN Conference on the Discrimination Against Indigenous Peoples of the Americas took place in Geneva. And out of that meeting, there was a proposal that established the United Nations Working Group, also started the process for a declaration on the collective rights of indigenous peoples, and also for the revision of the International Labor Organization's Convention 107. And you see here in the photos, indigenous peoples from the Americas who engaged at that meeting, calling for collective rights as peoples. Some of these folks in the photos are not with us anymore. So I apologize if anyone feels uncomfortable with that. But these are historic photos. Some of these photos show much younger versions of leaders that we still have around and are mentored from. And so it's important that we recognize that, just as we recognized Diskahe and Ratana. These are people who started out before us. We're not engaging in something new, but we're continuing. We're part of really a historic movement. And all of you today who have decided to engage in this process, engage in the permanent forum, engage in international work, you're also becoming part of a historic movement that has, a real beginning, has a story, and you should all be aware of that, all be aware of who came before you, so that we can continue to respect that and honor that and move it forward in a very positive and good way. So I mentioned the definition of indigenous peoples, and where a lot of those working definitions come from is from the 1981 study done by Jose Martinez Cobo, who was a special rapporteur of the subcommission on the prevention of discrimination and protection of minorities. And his definition really spoke similarly to what is being promoted today. Indigenous peoples, nations are those which, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of the societies now prevailing on those territories, or at least parts of them. They form at present non-dominant sectors of society and are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and their ethnic identity as the basis for their continued existence as peoples. This is very important, as peoples, in accordance with their own cultural patterns, social institutions, and legal system. So what I'm showing you here is just giving you an idea of some of the impact that Indigenous peoples have had on the system since the very early engagement. You have the development of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, a term we don't use today. We use Indigenous peoples, and that was a hard-fought transition there from populations to peoples. But that links us to the UN Charter. If you remember, that charter that the UN was founded on speaks about we the peoples, and that links us to our basic human right of self-determination. You have the revision here in 1989 of the ILO Convention. You have an international year and decade of the world's indigenous peoples. Very important for this discussion. Year 2000, Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is established, and you have other mechanisms like this Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples. You also have the second decade. There's also the expert mechanism that was developed, and probably one of the most significant achievements, something that took over 30 years, if you recall that I mentioned that this work started in that very early engagement in Geneva at that working group, is the adoption of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this really culminates this articulation of what are the collective rights of indigenous peoples in a way that can be used effectively for our peoples to advocate for the implementation of those rights at the local, national, and international level. So then you have the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. Later on, 2016, 2015, you have the Paris Agreement, hard-fought recognition for our rights in that agreement there. You see that recognition in the preamble. Some of us were there in Paris lobbying for that inclusion. Another important development that happened in Paris was the recognition of the indigenous people's traditional knowledge and the calling for the establishment of the local communities and indigenous peoples platform for a traditional knowledge exchange. Actually the highlight was to focus on our traditional knowledge, and this idea of this term local communities and indigenous peoples platform came later. But it's important because that's another opportunity for indigenous peoples to follow up within the UNFCCC, or the climate change agenda. You can interact with the facilitated working group of the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. That's another area that you can also investigate, research, and see if that's a place for you to engage. The Sustainable Development Agenda is something that you see across the UN. All over, you'll see this kind of rainbow icon here. And this is talking about the global goals. Indigenous peoples, our advocacy resulted in 6 direct references within the final outcome document. Goal 2 talks about agricultural output of indigenous small-scale farmers. Goal 4 talks about education. So the framework overall calls for indigenous peoples to be actively engaged in implementing sustainable development, including in follow-up and review. And that takes place annually during the high-level political forum in July. So that's another place that you want to think about engaging in if this is something that appeals to you, sustainable development. And really all of it should. We need to think about all these things. We need to consider all these areas because they're talking about our rights. So besides what's going on in the Economic and Social Council arm, we talked about the GA and the subsidiaries. And here we also want to talk about engagement in the Human Rights Council. This is another body where we can bring up actual human rights violations. And that council has the ability to, address those violations and discuss thematic issues. The council is made up of 47 member states. And that council also replaced the former Commission on Human Rights. So among the procedures and mechanisms important for engagement for indigenous peoples is the Universal Periodic Review. There's the complaint procedure, and there's also the special procedures, and I've mentioned the Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples, but there are others that you can engage with, and Andrea will be bringing that up in her presentation as well. There's the work of the UN treaty bodies. These are committees of independent experts who are in charge of monitoring the implementation of the implementation of these treaties by the parties and the rights protected within these treaties as well. So there's 9 core international rights treaties that deal with civil and political rights, economic and social and cultural rights, racial discrimination, torture, discrimination against women, child rights, migrant rights, etc. And so the main functions of these treaty bodies are to examine the periodic reports. In other words, countries submit reports on how they feel that they're progressing on these treaties or implementing. And these bodies come up with concluding observations, or they consider individual complaints. So concluding observations is another area where we can impact as Indigenous peoples. We can engage in these treaty bodies as well. So I'm just going to take 1 minute because I see that there's a note happening for me here, and I want to make sure that, okay, one, there's a comment here to ask people to mute because there is some background noise going on. And as well, the Spanish translation seems to have not been working. I'm going to take a pause. Arturo, has that been resolved?
Roberto, we are trying.
Okay, so
We're trying, yes.
so I'll just continue on then.
It's been on and off, but now apparently it's working, okay?
All right, thank you very much. And we apologize, as you know, when you're dealing with the internet and these kind of functions, there is always a chance for some kind of technical difficulty. But just to get back to the treaty bodies, to date, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, or the CERD, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and most recently, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, have adopted general comments specifically addressing Indigenous people's rights. Now, during the pandemic, this impacted the activities of the treaty bodies, but even though they were with a limited capacity and they issued a limited number of concluding observations, committees continued to remind state parties of their obligation to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples, and including our collective rights. And you remember we just spoke about that a little bit earlier, and our free, prior, and informed consent. And a compilation of these materials you can access at the OHCHR website. Now, some other opportunities within the UN system, and I'm just going to mention this very briefly because at the end of our session, towards the end of our session, we'll be getting into this a little more, but you have the Voluntary Fund, which offers financial support in the form of grants to attend specific meetings that Indigenous peoples would find and very useful and important to be at. There's also the Indigenous Fellowship Program, which is a comprehensive training program. You're getting an introductory level program today, but this is a more comprehensive, longer term program. There's also a fund with the Convention on Biological Diversity that helps to facilitate participation of Indigenous peoples to that body as well. And engaging in the Convention on Biological Diversity, one important entryway is the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Biodiversity. That's the Indigenous Peoples coordination body within the climate change track, or the UNFCCC. There's the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. And finally, within the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Agenda, you can connect with the Indigenous people major group on the Sustainable Development Goals. So in summary, we learned who we are, as Indigenous peoples, what this means in the context. And this is important because even today you hear statements like, we're all Indigenous, local communities and Indigenous peoples might be the same. It's really not. They're really distinct. Everyone is not Indigenous, at least in the UN context. And this is important to understand, especially as we advocate. We learned a little bit about why we come to the United Nations, taking our issues, raising that visibility for the respect of our human rights, our inherent indivisible rights. We know that we're part of a historic movement. And that movement has seen incremental advances over the years. You've seen the impact that Indigenous peoples have had. Besides getting that introduction, you've learned a little bit about the treaty bodies and other opportunities to engage in the system. So this is actually where I'm going to end. You can connect with me personally through social media, but visit Project Access online and also engage all of the partners that we have today, all of them doing good work. And I really encourage you to look at the work of all these organizations a little bit more closely. So I'm going to stop my share here. I don't know if there are or if we are continuing to have the issue in Spanish. Arturo, is that resolved now?
It's been resolved, Roberto. Thank you.
Okay, great. Wonderful. So with that, I want to go right to our next presentation. Take a deep breath and introduce Andrea Carmen, the Executive Director of the International Indian Treaty Council. Andrea, when you're ready, you have the floor.
I was on mute. I'll start again. Chokweltesia, thank you very much. Greetings, my relatives in all the time zones. For me, it's very good morning to you. I'm very pleased to be part of this. I've been one of the main trainers for the Project Access program for many years. I can never remember exactly how many, but it's one of my favorite things to do. And many of the leaders in the Indigenous peoples movement internationally came through the Project Access training. And I've been so gratified to see many of our Indigenous alumni from Project Access take important roles as experts in some of these bodies that we've been talking about. I'm going to undertake a real challenge for myself here, which is to share my screen to show a PowerPoint, and hopefully I'll be able to do it. Oh, yay. Okay, can everybody see? Yes, tell me okay?
Yes,
Roberto?
all good.
Okay, all right, okay, great. I'm going to talk a little bit about specifically this body that we're discussing today, and hopefully that many of you will be attending in person. What's called the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, what it is not, and how can we best use it, with a couple of examples. This is from last year's session. A couple of our young people getting ready or just finishing reading. I'm there clapping because they did so well. But I want to remind you, this is from the United Nations web television. So when you're reading, you're not just addressing the room, you're going to be addressing the world. And when you sit next to someone who's reading, remember, don't fall asleep or pick your nose. You're going to be on the screen as well. So this is important to remember, that our voices are being amplified on behalf of our peoples, but also on behalf of all Indigenous peoples and the issues that we are addressing. I am trying to move my screen. Oh, great. Okay, sorry. Roberto already showed some of these pictures from the entry of Indigenous peoples into the United Nations formally for the first time, that took place in 1977. Some of our founders of the International Indian Treaty Council are there leading this march. But this journey was undertaken and began, as Roberto said, because Indigenous peoples, not just from North America, but throughout the Americas at that time, recognized that there was no justice for us within what was called the justice systems of the colonial states. In fact, they were either complicit or directly responsible for the human rights violations we were suffering, in particular, the lack of implementation of our nation-to-nation treaties, respect for our land rights, our cultures, and our ways of life. And so the decision was made at a meeting that formed the International Indian Treaty Council in 1974, attended by about 5,000 delegates, to seek a voice in the international arena, to sit with the family of nations, as nations and peoples, with our own rights and governance systems and identities. And so this was the very first conference, Indigenous peoples entering the United Nations for the first time. And as Roberto said, very importantly, at that conference, and it's very important to recognize the history, not just what happened at the League of Nations with the Indigenous leaders who were not even allowed to enter the League of Nations. I think Descahe stayed there many years, trying at least to be able to get in the room. So this was a very historic moment, but one of the recommendations, I think at those days we called them demands, was to have a home in the United Nations through the establishment of a body for Indigenous peoples, but also to begin developing a United Nations standard recognizing Indigenous peoples' collective rights, which of course became the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples with an S, because as Indigenous peoples, our rights, of course, are recognized for individuals, but they are exercised as part of our collectivities, as our citizenship in our peoples and our nations. We hold our land rights collectively. We practice our cultures collectively. And I could go on, as you well know. The working group on Indigenous populations, again, that's as far as we could get at that time, was being called populations, existed from 1982 to 2006. And it was the first official body working on Indigenous people's rights. So it really was the grandmother or grandfather, grandparent of the Permanent Forum and all the other bodies that we have now and mechanisms. It carried out key studies that are still active and alive to this day. Studies on treaties and agreements, lands and resources, free, prior, and informed consent, cultural heritage. And as Roberto mentioned, very importantly, its intent was not there to do this, but this was us being there as participants, launching an international network of Indigenous peoples. That is really the reason we've been able to achieve what we've been able to achieve today. I will say, as Roberto said, the United Nations is the home of the states. It's a creation of the states. The states are the members. The countries are the members. We are not the members, but we've been able to utilize it to advance. Every single thing we've gained there came from the movement of Indigenous peoples engaging in this body. And of course, the working group drafted the original text of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I think we got about 80% of that original text into the final version that was adopted at the General Assembly. We began talking there. The first meetings I ever went to were informal meetings to talk about the UN Permanent Forum during the working group. And around 2000, we realized that a working group wasn't going to be permanent. And in fact, it was abolished in 2006. And so we needed something that would last and be able to be more of a permanent home. And as a result of Indigenous peoples' engagement with states about the development of something more permanent and at a higher level, because the working group was under the subcommission on the protection of minorities. And that was under the old Human Rights Commission, which was also abolished and gave way to the council, the Human Rights Council. We were able to get a permanent forum established. And its mandate was as follows: the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues shall serve as an advisory body to the Council, that's Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, with a mandate to discuss Indigenous issues within the mandate of the Council, that's ECOSOC, relating to economic and social development, culture, the environment, education, health, and human rights. This is the Abya Caucus addressing the Permanent Forum back in 2008, one of the regional caucuses that functions there. In doing so, again, this is the formal adopted mandate, the Permanent Forum shall provide expert advice and recommendations on Indigenous issues to the Council. Notice the word issues, not rights, as well as to programs, funds, and agencies of the United Nations through the Council. I've underlined those words. The report of the Permanent Forum goes to the Economic and Social Council for adoption every year. It would raise awareness and promote integration and coordination of activities relating to Indigenous issues within the United Nations system, and prepare and disseminate information on Indigenous issues. And these are all photos of some of our leaders and young people addressing the Permanent Forum. Okay, given that, I will say what our goals, and we as International and Treaty Council, along with other Indigenous organizations, engaged in several workshops with states to develop the mandate of the Permanent Forum. And the goals that we had specifically, I would say we got most of them, but not all of them. Just keep that in mind. We wanted a higher level placement than the working group on Indigenous populations. It was low level in the UN system. And we achieved that. The Permanent Forum is directly under one of the main bodies of the United Nations, ECOSOC, or the UN Economic and Social Council, and it's in New York. And we wanted it to be in New York, even though we continue to be more comfortable, I think, working in Geneva, where the human rights structure of the United Nations is based, because we didn't want it just to address human rights. We wanted it to be able to address a range of issues that affect Indigenous peoples. So it is more permanent, and luckily we have this because the working group was dissolved in 2006, and it was replaced in the UN system with the UN expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples directly under the Human Rights Council. We wanted half of the experts to be Indigenous peoples. And this was important. There was a lot of debate. We said, why can't all the members be Indigenous peoples? But then we said, well, then they'll have us meeting in some closet somewhere. They're not going to pay attention to what we say unless states are also engaged. So we did get that formula of 8 members nominated by Indigenous peoples, not selected. We get to nominate, and ECOSOC selects, and 8 members selected by the states. These are independent experts. They're not representatives. That's what is important to remember as well. But the one thing we didn't get, maybe one of the most important, is we wanted this to have a really strong mandate. We envisioned a body that could go in and respond when Indigenous people's rights were being violated, to be able to get some results. And we didn't get that. We got an advisory body that makes recommendations to ECOSOC. And also, of course, especially after the adoption of the UN Declaration, we've been trying to get the name changed to be Indigenous peoples, but still, for some reason that has never been adequately explained to me, it's still called issues, and we have to keep raising this issue. It should be called the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples, of course. Now, this is what is the UN Permanent Forum. I already said it's an advisory body made up of 16 independent experts. We have a good opportunity for networking with Indigenous peoples, with UN agencies, funders, states, NGOs. Don't be reluctant to go and talk to the state that you're from or another state that's spearheading a concern you have. They expect you to come up and talk to them, at least introduce yourself. This is an opportunity to talk to high-level representatives of the countries that you're from in a way that is almost impossible to do here from the home front. You can talk to some undersecretary of the secretary to the janitor or something. There you can talk to high-level officials of the states that you're from. It's a way to build awareness, get your issue out there, get it heard. Again, I showed the television. You're going to be talking to the world when you speak there. It's a place also to learn about and to impact the United Nations system. I'm going to give you a couple examples in a minute of how we've been able to use it. It's a place to learn and network about other struggles through the side events. And also, if somebody makes an intervention on an issue you're working on, go talk to them and see how you can work together. And it's a place to make statements, short, 3 minutes, and I'm serious about that. Rochelle's going to talk about drafting the interventions. A few years ago, the chair would say, please conclude your statement. They don't do that anymore. They cut your mic. Your mic goes dead at 3 minutes. Doesn't matter if you're on your very last, most important recommendation. You have 3 minutes, so you need to practice. What it's not a human rights complaint body or mechanism. It's not set up to do that. It's not going to address your individual human rights struggle. It will talk about general issues. So you give examples about your struggle to address, say, more action on human rights defenders, for example. It's not really a place to address your specific issue, even though everybody does that because that's what we want to do. But you can use that as an example of something the Permanent Forum needs to tell the UN system to do better. It's not usually a place to denounce specific state actions. And I want to commend the current chair of the Permanent Forum, Dario Mejia, who was the only chair I've ever seen of the Permanent Forum, and I have never missed a session so far, that told states they do not have the right to reply in the UN Permanent Forum. The Permanent Forum can make its own rules, and they complained at ECOSOC. I watched it on TV, but still ECOSOC upheld the Permanent Forum's right to make its own rules of procedure. They can get on the speakers list. The states will do that. They get 3 minutes also, but they don't have a right to refute what you say, which was really historic last year. And I was very, very proud of our Permanent Forum current chair. And it's not a place to get quick results or responses. And I'll give you some examples of how long it takes, as long as we're persistent and we follow through on whatever we get out of the Permanent Forum. Now, I just want to bring up that there will be opportunities to address specific human rights violations there. Our current UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Francisco Calizay, will be there. There will be an agenda item for interactive dialogue with him, as well as the UN Expert Mechanism, the MRIP. But he also makes appointments with people if you want to talk about how to actually utilize the human rights complaint mechanism system at the UN. You can make an appointment to do that with him there. His email is, maybe you could put it in the chat, Indigenous at OHCHR, Roberto. The Permanent Forum has a very specific mandated role in carrying out the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is Article 42 of the UN Declaration. The United Nations, its bodies, including the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, specifically named, shall promote respect for and full application of the provisions of this declaration, the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's very important that you tie your interventions and recommendations to articles of the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Just to go over quickly the structure of the Permanent Forum. I mentioned it's 8 nominees by Indigenous peoples of the regions, and it's organized regionally. And more of the state representatives are now also Indigenous members. Africa has and Latin America have 2 seats because there are 7 regions and 8 slots, and those rotate between, you know, Africa and Latin America. One session, a 3-year session, Africa will get 2 seats, and the next one, Latin America, will get 2. The rest of the regions have, and also Asia, sorry. These are 3 regions that rotate between 1 and 2 seats. The regions that have 1 seat are Central America, Eastern Europe, Russia Federation, Central Asia and Caucasia, long name to that region, North America, Pacific, and Arctic. And those last 3 are regions that Indigenous peoples decided that we needed to have, because those regions are not included in the 5 regions officially that the United Nations has. We're lumped together with something called Northern Europe or Western Europe and other groups, WEOG. But we have North America, Pacific, and Arctic as regions of Indigenous peoples have their own seats at the Permanent Forum. Again, they're not independent, or they're not regional reps. Those are not our representatives. They're considered independent experts. They are selected at the end of the day after we nominate from the regions by the ECOSOC president. Sometimes we're happy with the selection and sometimes we're not. And this is important too in your strategy. The final report and the recommendations have to be agreed by consensus of all 16 member states. That means the state representatives as well as the Indigenous peoples members. So important to remember, there's a lot of horse trading that goes on behind the scenes, and that's going to govern how you're going to formulate the recommendations you want them to adopt. Important areas for participation, you can make interventions, get to know the Secretariat. They can be a big help. Arturo can speak to that maybe. Also for dialogue with the states and UN agencies, you want the UN Food and Agriculture Organization to take a position like we do on the change and amendment in the Code of Conduct on Pesticides to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples. That's a good place to dialogue with them. Dialogue also with the human rights bodies that are there, like the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the MRIP. You can talk directly to the Permanent Forum members. Don't be afraid to approach them, ask them to have coffee, you know, figure out who's going to be spearheading the issues that you care about the most. You focus on specific themes, review past recommendations and speak to those. Look, please, everybody, I'm skipping ahead. Part of your homework is to read the report of the Permanent Forum from last year in case you want to commend something, you know, to appreciate a resolution, a recommendation they made. And you can influence the outcomes. The most important thing is the final report and the recommendations that are in it. I'm going to go quickly. I don't know why this picture's on the side here, but of a couple of achievements that we have made using the Permanent Forum. Please don't get discouraged because they're not going to step in and help your leader get out of jail. They just don't do that. But they can make important contributions to work that you're doing on the ground. And again, as Roberto said, this is part of your strategy. The most important is the activism of your peoples and nations on the ground. This is an example, 2 examples from my nation, the Yaqui Nation. Specifically the part of our nation that's in Mexico. We're divided by the border between the United States and Mexico, Arizona and Sonora, Mexico. Many of our children die and are born with birth defects because of the application of pesticides by airplanes and by spraying. And many of these are pesticides that have been banned for use in the exporting country because they're known to be dangerous. Indigenous women meeting together to address this issue, as well as mercury contamination, as well as the impacts of mining, called these activities environmental violence. Back in 2012, this is the second International Indigenous Women's Symposium on environmental and reproductive health. Because they're known to be dangerous, and yet they're still used, and they're especially dangerous to Indigenous women's reproductive health and the health of our future generations. We base this work on Article 29, which talks about the right of free, prior, and informed consent by Indigenous peoples before hazardous materials have been disseminated. This is a picture of us informing women from our Yaqui communities about the known impacts of these pesticides and why they were seeing so many birth defects and children even born with leukemia. Also, Article 22 that talks about the prevention of violence against Indigenous women and children. It calls on states. It says states shall, not should, but shall take measures to ensure that Indigenous women and children enjoy the full protection and guarantees against all forms of violence and discrimination. And we said Indigenous women from the grassroots says, why not environmental violence? And the Permanent Forum at the very beginning took on this call by Indigenous women, and in 2012 they recognized environmental violence as a new term, but a very applicable term to the introduction of environmental toxins released in the environment, which cause severe and ongoing harm to Indigenous women, girls, and unborn generations, in the report of an expert meeting that they held in 2012. Based on this, and this is again a lot of advocacy, the Permanent Forum's not going to just do these things because they think of them. We have to ask them, we have to talk to the members, we have to sometimes write recommendations that we want them to adopt. They called for an international legal review to be carried out by the Special Rapporteur on Toxics in 2007 of the use of banned pesticides that is allowed by international law, the Rotterdam Convention. And as a result, the rapporteur, Basket Tunkat, came back to the Permanent Forum after beginning to study the issue and said that Indigenous people, such as the Yaqui, have suffered grave adverse impacts on their health and dignity from the ongoing use of highly hazardous pesticides. These pesticides are often imported from countries, I'll interject, like the United States, Germany, that have banned their use domestically because of uncontrollable and unreasonable risks. This is an expert group seminar that we organized to address this study, held in Mexico in 2019. We had other inputs. And in 2022, just last year, this is our esteemed chair of the Permanent Forum, the president, Dario Mejia. This is in the resolutions from last year, the recommendations, says the Permanent Forum calls on FAO, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and the World Health Organization to amend the International Code of Conduct on Pesticide Management to take into account the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. Just in November, based on that recommendation, myself and Saul Vicente Vasquez from Mexico, from our board of directors, met and were invited to attend what's called the joint meeting on pesticides management that monitors the code of conduct on pesticides, and they accepted our call and the Permanent Forum's request to amend the code of conduct on pesticides to include the rights of Indigenous peoples. And just at this meeting of the Permanent Forum, there will be a presentation by CEDAW, which is the treaty body, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, that includes the issue of environmental violence, their new general recommendation. We were invited to present on this issue, and they did include it. They said the failure of states to take adequate action to prevent, adapt to, and remediate these serious instances of environmental harm constitutes a form of discrimination and violence against Indigenous women and girls that needs to be properly addressed. This is a UN treaty body taking on the call of the grassroots women through the advocacy of the UN Permanent Forum. This is a good example. I'm going to give just one other example of how we've used the Permanent Forum, because I will say, brothers and sisters, many Indigenous peoples will say the Permanent Forum doesn't do anything. It's just advisory to ECOSOC. Why should we even bother? Others feel like making a statement at the Permanent Forum is all they need to do, and they've done their job and they go home. Neither one of those things is true. Through our persistence and our advocacy and our work with the Permanent Forum, we can get them to do very concrete things that then we can take to further work in the United Nations that then make an impact on the ground. This is Article 12. I'm going to give you one other example. And it says states shall, again, important to recognize, that was a hard fought word. Through those 30 years of negotiation, the states, of course, wanted it to say should, but we said no, has to say shall. This is mandatory. That's why we reject that this is not a legally binding document. It says that they will enable the access and repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains through their possession, in their position, through fair, transparent, and effective mechanisms developed in conjunction with Indigenous peoples concerned. The World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, which will be another agenda item there for us to comment on various commitments that the states made in that outcome document, also commits to develop a mechanism for repatriation of our sacred items and human remains. The Permanent Forum in 2015 held a 3-hour consultation. This is a picture of it. In front are Indigenous speakers and also UNESCO and other UN speakers addressing the need to develop such a mechanism. Our items are held in museums all over the world and universities, human remains and sacred items that are vital for the spiritual health of our peoples on the ground. And one example, of course, that's become very well known is our Yaqui Masakova, our traditional ceremonial deer's head. Because of the work of the Permanent Forum, I was invited to invite UNESCO on this issue in 2016. The UN Expert Mechanism on Rights of Indigenous Peoples took up the specific case of our Masakova held in the Government Museum in Stockholm, Sweden for many decades. This is us meeting during the Permanent Forum with the members of the Expert Mechanism. They held an expert seminar in March 2021 on this issue, March 2020, sorry. And this is our Yaqui delegation addressing the issue of the Masakova. The UN Human Rights Council had called, as a result of our work, for the creation of this mechanism and the activity of UNESCO in this regard, which has not happened yet, sad to say. But because of what happened last year at the UN Permanent Forum, where the UN Special Rapporteur, the chair of the Permanent Forum, the chair of the MRIP, and the government of Mexico all called upon Sweden to return the Masakova. There's a picture of it there. We don't take pictures of it, but they had a picture of it there. This is us on June 3rd in 2022 in Stockholm, signing an agreement for the return of the Masakova. And this all came about because of the international pressure of the Permanent Forum and the MRIP on Sweden to finally return the Masakova. The theme for this year is Indigenous Peoples, Human Health, Planetary and Territorial Health, and Climate Change, a rights-based approach. And this is, of course, demonstrations against mining in Guatemala. We need to reflect on this article, Article 32. which calls on free, prior, informed consent before development can take place. And I will mention that this not only includes extractive development, it includes something we're seeing now on the creation of protected areas in the name of conservation and sustainable development that is also violating the rights of Indigenous peoples. It reflects on our spiritual relationship with the land and our responsibilities to future generations in this regard. It pertains to Article 24 on our right to health and traditional health-related practices, including the conservation of our vital medicinal plants, animals, and minerals. It reflects on our subsistence rights, Article 20, and the international standing of treaties, Article 37, including the treaty right to hunt and fish, free of environmental contamination. I know I'm almost finished with my presentation here. I'm getting texts. I'm not sure what they say, but I'll just finish up here quickly. Again, the methods of work.
Andrea, you have some time. There's no, you don't, you just speak, continue to speak slowly. You do have some time.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. I'm looking at that. I'm getting texts and I can't read them, but anyway, thank you for letting me know that. I just have a couple more slides.
You're doing well over time. You're doing well. You have about 20 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Might have time for some questions.
Once I start on a roll, it's hard to say, you know, how much time. But thank you. The first week, we're going to take you through the agenda items. Rochelle's going to do that, so you can plan what your most effective strategy is. When it says closed sessions, that means just the members. The second week, there will be a couple of more agenda items, but a lot of it's going to be focused on regional dialogues. Last year, they had other regions, the dialogues with the states for you to speak directly to the countries in your region. And remember, you're going to sign up, and Roberto's going to explain, or Rochelle, how you're going to do that. The last couple years, well, during the pandemic, it was all virtual. So everything was online. Last year, it was hybrid, both online for statements and for signing up and in the room. And this year they've gone back to all in person. So listen carefully and look on the screen when they call for you to sign up for the agenda item, usually one session before the agenda item that you really want to address. And the members want less recommendations in the final report. Read the final report from last year. There are not a lot of recommendations, and they involve general issues, not specific situations, even though I think there might be one in there about the war, the invasion of Russia and Ukraine. But that's an extraordinary circumstance. So be selective. You know, that old saying, if you could talk to God, what would be your one question? If your dream could come true and the permanent forum could include a recommendation on the issue most near and dear to your peoples, your nations, your Indigenous community, what would that be? And how are you going to work on that? So you're much more effective if you can really zero in on one or two recommendations in your statement. And remember, you only have 3 minutes, so you need to practice that. We're going to do that in the on-site training that's coming up before the permanent forum for those of you that will be there. But I want to mention, for those of you who are not going to be at the permanent forum, this is a process you want to go through with every UN body where you have an opportunity to make a statement. You practice the time, reading not too fast, medium speed, so the translators can keep up, and really target in on the mandate of that body and what you can get done there to further your issue. And remember, that's not enough. You have to, the examples I showed, took continuous advocacy from the ground. from the impacted Indigenous peoples through the representatives they sent to various UN bodies. And finally, you do get a result that then we have to take back. To be effective, you read and understand the agenda. Prepare 3-minute interventions with 1 or 2 key recommendations. Follow up and comment on last year's recommendations. There were some very important recommendations that at least the International Treaty Council strongly supports. I highlighted one about the Code of Conduct on Pesticides. Another one was the position of the Permanent Forum on separating Indigenous peoples from local communities, which is an issue that states are using to undermine the rights of Indigenous peoples, both in UN bodies and, more important, on the ground around land rights. Tie in the UN declaration, practice your statement, stay in the room when you're signed up to read. That's not the time to go find the ladies' room or the men's room. And that has happened before, believe me. Go before, do not leave the room, because there are so many people on the speakers list. If they call you and you're not there, there's a good chance that you will not be able to come back and make your statement again. Breathe. I always tell people before they speak, while they're calling your name, take 3 deep breaths. You're going to raise your hand so that they know where you are in the room. You're going to press the speaker's button on your microphone, and while you're doing that, you're taking 3 deep breaths so you're not out of breath or panicky when you read. Read calmly and not too fast. Keep your pages on your desk in front, because sometimes you'll hear people, those microphones are really sensitive. They're reading calmly, but they're nervous, and you will be nervous. I'm nervous before they call me. It's natural, it's normal. A little bit of stage fright gives that adrenaline and gives you force while you're reading, but don't rattle your page. You could hear that paper rattling. Keep it on the desk. Also participate in the caucuses. The general, I don't call it the global, even though some people do, because some regions have pulled out of official participation. But, participate in the caucuses and get to know the people. And you also can be a mentor. What you've learned, you can share. Participate in side events for networking on your issue. There's going to be a lot of side events. That first Friday, the week of the first Friday, it's a closed session. The UN is on holiday that day, but there'll be a lot of side events where you can network with other Indigenous peoples working on the issues that you care about, and stick together, help each other. It's going to be a lot of people, and a lot of them are not going to know what to do at all. They haven't been through training at all. And try to impact the final report. Talk to the Permanent Forum members that you mentioned. Help them when you read, whether you read or not. Give them the recommendation you want in there. Present it to a member of the Permanent Forum or the Secretariat, and follow up on it. Is your recommendation getting in there? Because, like I mentioned, behind closed doors, there's a lot of horse trading. I'll say, well, you support this from my constituencies, and I'll support this, and this one has to go. There's not room, because they're also limited in space. So work your issue. Don't be afraid to do that. Don't just make your statement. Stand together to support each other. This is, we used to do joint interventions through Project Access. We're not going to be doing that this year. These will be your own statements, but your fellow trainees can stand up and support you. And this is a picture of the trainees from a few years ago standing while the representative of Project Access does that. You'll see the Youth Caucus. There's a Global Youth Caucus. Please find it and participate in it if you're a youth, if you're a young person, and they do stand up behind each other while somebody's reading their collective statement. It's very impressive and also gives that support. Apply and share what you learn when you get back home. And that's actually one of the criteria and requirements for this training is, this is an example. There's the UN Declaration. At a meeting of the San Francisco Magu Community Council, where they declared their land to be a food sovereignty zone to support their resistance to imposed development. This is a picture of the front table where they're referring to the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples to assert their rights. And the person that chaired this was Berenice Sanchez, a Project Access alumni. And so she took what she learned back to her community and used it to actually make changes and to strengthen the position of her Indigenous people to resist imposed development. And now it's up to you. This is a picture from 2017 of Project Access participants and trainees. You can recognize many leaders in the UN system now that went through this training and leaders in their organizations. And it's really important that you recognize that the most important work and the only reason we've ever got anything done in these almost 50 years at the United Nations is the activism and the commitment and the dedication of our own peoples on the ground to follow up on whatever you may get out of this session and take it to the next level. Always push to the next step. Thank you. Chokweltesia.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for that presentation. We understand that this is a lot of information in a very short time. However, this is the nature of the process. This is an introductory level training, and we will make some of these materials available to folks who are interested. I think that if we can reach out, we can work with the UN Voluntary Fund, for example, to connect with people through their emails and follow up perhaps with a link to some of the presentations that were made today so that you can have these and go over them following this program. Also, there was a number of questions that had come up in the Q&A, but many of them have been answered as we've been moving along. So thank you to the panelists who've been doing that as well. There was one question, Andrea, that I know you did address this already, but it could be perhaps some people came in later to the presentation than others and may not have heard all the information that you shared. But there was one question that says, is there a mechanism or tribunal for Indigenous peoples where Indigenous peoples can approach on their issues? And maybe you just want to highlight this again, because I know you brought this up on what is and what is not the Permanent Forum.
Yes, the UN Permanent Forum is a place to really impact. I said all the things that you could do there, but it's a formal mandate is to impact the United Nations system to improve its performance relating to the rights of Indigenous peoples. And in resolutions that we do every year on Indigenous peoples' rights, say at the UN Human Rights Council, the UN Expert Mechanism on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and other bodies. We're taking the resolution, for instance, on local communities that was adopted last year at the Permanent Forum into the Convention on Biological Diversity and into the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change work. These can be utilized by us to get work done and improve the responses of bodies throughout the UN system that we are interested in. I gave the example of how we've been able to move the UN Food and Agriculture Organization and World Health Organization to actually be willing for the first time to amend the International Code of Conduct on Pesticides to include free, prior, informed consent and rights of Indigenous peoples. And there will be a side event on that at this year's Permanent Forum, I think on Wednesday, if people are interested in that. Also, as I mentioned before, if you have a specific human rights violation you want to address, your best way to actually get results on that and a response is to contact the UN Special Rapporteur on Rights of Indigenous Peoples or other special rapporteurs. I think just in the last year, we have submitted human rights complaints to the urgent action early warning procedure of the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics, the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, the Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion, very important for us, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders. These are all bodies in the UN system that we can access directly. You don't have to be a lawyer or anything like that. And they have a website. If you look on the website of the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, you can look at all of these human rights investigators and mechanisms. There's a working group on arbitrary detentions that we've been working with on the case of Leonard Peltier. There's a lot of places where you can take the human rights violations impacting your peoples directly. And, you know, any of us will be really happy to advise you on how to do that. But here at the Permanent Forum, I know the rapporteur on toxics and human rights, Marcos Orellana will be there because I know he's speaking on the panel on the foul code of conduct on pesticides. But make an appointment with Francisco Calitzai if you have an individual human rights violation from your peoples that you want addressed in the UN system. The Permanent Forum is not, unfortunately, the place. You can mention it when you talk, but they're not going to include that in their recommendations. They may add it to the weight of a recommendation that's a general recommendation, for example, on whatever the issue that is of concern to your peoples. Again, what Roberto said is we used to have this as a 2-year participation, you know, that Project Access was 2 years in a row. And that second year, after people participated in the Permanent Forum, they came back and said, now I see what you were talking about when you said, you know, whatever, 3 minutes or, you know, whatever it is, you know, look at the agenda, you know, work with the members to get your issues in the final report. So, you know, you will not see a lot of this in action until you actually participate in the session. And it's a good way to be reminded. I know, like Roberto says, it's a lot of information coming out of many, many decades of experience and mistakes that we've made in the past too. You know, we say, okay, that didn't work, let's try this. So again, it's an engagement that takes follow-up and persistence and often many years of commitment to follow something through, even if you get a really good recommendation. Your dream comes true and you get, you know, what you want in the report. Okay, then what? Where are you going to take that next? You know, where are you going to go with that to make a difference on the ground? How are you going to use it to influence the state, whatever country you're from, to change their policies, for example?
Thank you so much, Andrea. And we're getting close to the time for our next presentation. I think you've actually answered some of the disparate questions that come up in there. And just to remind folks that we will make the presentations available. And I was just chatting with Arturo from the UN Voluntary Fund Office, and they said that they will post the presentations. You can find them. Eventually, they'll be posted later today also at the Project Access website. And you can reach out to any one of us. We're all on social media. And you can contact us through our websites, International Indian Treaty Council, or any of the partners to engage if you have further questions. Again, this is an introductory session. This is different from what we do in our regular Project Access trainings. So you're not going to get all of your answers here, or you're not going to learn everything, but we hope that you are finding some utility in what we're presenting. So with that, I want to introduce our next speaker, Rochelle Diver, who's going to take you into the actual intervention, that statement that you will hopefully be making if that's part of your strategy at the upcoming Permitted Forum. So Rochelle, with that, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Roberto, for the kind introduction. And thank you to Andrea for your vast and informative presentation. We're really lucky to have insight from learned experiences from so many years of, as you said, trial and error, but also evolving with the forum from the beginning to the point that it is now. I think that's just so valuable for our new trainees. So thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen while I introduce myself a bit further. Rochelle Diver, Anishinaabe. I am calling in today from my homelands, Naga Chiwanang in our Anishinaabe-Moan language, known as Fond du Lac Reservation in northern Minnesota. I'm so happy to be here. Most importantly, I am a former participant and graduate of Project Access in 2013 and 2014. And so really what I'm sharing with you today is some technical advice and information on interventions themselves, but also that firsthand experience that Andrea referenced that you just learn from trial and error. So I hope that my experiences can help you. And I'm going to go ahead and jump right in here. So we really just need to think about and try to process all of the information that has been provided so far. And I know that's why many of you are asking for the slides and for the recording, because it really is a lot to take in. And I don't want anyone to stress themselves that you really need to have memorized all this information by the time you get to the forum. Everybody will be learning together as they go. And we as Project Access and other alumni from the program will be there to assist you at the forum as well. We'll be physically present to answer your questions, to help walk you through some of the, signing up and, as things change, we have to be fluid, but we're there to support you in that case. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. I don't want to repeat anything Andrea said or Roberto, and I know these slides are heavy with a lot of information, but once again, that's why they're made to be shared. So I do want to make some time for questions and answers at the end. And also, we're getting a lot of questions over the Q&A. We're doing our best to answer them. We appreciate your patience on that, and we hope you'll continue to use the Q&A to ask specific questions that hopefully we can address in the last 10 minutes or so of this time we have for interventions. Okay. So this year is not, the UN Permanent Forum decided against a hybrid version. They are going 100% in person. That is for participation only. UN Web TV was mentioned. So if you are not attending, you will have the opportunity to watch each session live. And then they also go into an archive on the Web TV website. So you can go back and watch specific sessions. So it's already been addressed that there is a time limit. I would only add right now we are given 3 minutes. That still can change. I would suggest that you prepare a 3-minute intervention, but also a 2-minute intervention, because sometimes we don't have a lot of advance warning that there has been a change. You'll see once you get there, this is the second largest United Nations meeting of all. The first is the women's gathering, which just happened a few weeks ago in New York. There will be a lot of people in attendance. It can be very difficult to have the opportunity to read your intervention. So be prepared for a 3-minute, for a 2-minute, and unfortunately be prepared to possibly not make the floor. Not to be negative at all, but I think it's really important to be realistic. The first year that I was there, I was so prepared, I was ready, but unfortunately time ran out and we weren't called on. So that is a reality that can happen. Being familiar with the program of work, we're actually going to go through this together in just a minute. I'm going to pull that up and we can see what each of the agenda items are, and that will help you in drafting your interventions, finding which place or places are best suited to the topic of your intervention. And it's also important to be very open-minded and the way that you look at these agenda items. We can fit our issues in many different places. It's just how we word them and the framing of it. So if it doesn't, you read the agenda item and it might not initially jump out at you as your focus of work or the focus of your community, just think about how you can be creative and fit that in there, because the more opportunities we have to take the floor, the more times we request it for different agenda items, the better chance we have of having our voices heard. Each organization is only able to request the floor one time per agenda item. So that's also something to keep in mind. Some organizations register their own delegates, but also assist with registration of other delegates. You will have to take the time to come together and decide who will be reading, submitting, and hopefully delivering on each agenda item, so that people aren't overlapping in work that are a part of your delegation. Consider making a joint statement. This is really, really important because there is a hierarchy, unofficial hierarchy given to statements. The chair is the one who, of course, is in charge of moderating the session and calling on speakers, but they do give priority to joint statements and umbrella organizations or multi-regional organizations. This is a mistake I made in my first year, is signing up for an intervention and they asked where the organization was based. So I gave them the country in which our main office is in. That put us down on the agenda, way further down, to a point where it would be nearly impossible to make the floor, whereas an umbrella organization stipulates multi-regional membership or affiliation and is given a bit more priority to make the floor. So just a little tip for you there. And we're going to go now into the organization of work together. We're opening up on the first week. There'll be an opening session that the UN sessions are usually 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. and 3 to 6. The 2-hour lunch in the middle is usually filled with side events, and hopefully you have time to get a quick bite. But the opening day will feature, of course, a traditional opening from the Indigenous peoples of what is now known as New York. And this opening session is usually just an opportunity to welcome everybody and deal with adopting the agenda and the organization of work, not really delving much into the issues. That will be for 3 o'clock when the main agenda will start. And so we see here item 5G, thematic dialogues, International Decade of Indigenous Languages, and Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW. So you'll see this agenda item actually has 2 topics. So you can choose in your 3 minutes to hit on both or choose one. But this gives you a good example of how we need to be creative and maneuver the way they have organized the program of work. And pay attention, there's 5G, 5F, and you're able to intervene on each of the different items there. Going into Tuesday, this is extremely important to acknowledge the theme and connect your interventions to the theme that is for this year. And as Andrea said as well, connecting you know, the requests in your intervention or the recommendations that you're making with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I will scroll through here a bit to give you an idea. I will also share the Permanent Forum website in the chat when I'm finished. So you can go directly to the Permanent Forum webpage, which has the meeting documents in all 6 languages. And you will be able to go through that. You'll also be able to find the referenced report from last year's session. So that web page will provide you with everything you need. You just need to have some time to go through it and read the reports and read some of the outcomes from previous years. That can be really helpful for you, especially if one of the recommendations that you'll be presenting has been covered or recommended in previous years. So I suggest going through as many of the reports as possible and using the keyword search mechanism of the PDFs to see if you know, there has been a connection made in the past. And you can also reference that then in your intervention to make it just a bit stronger. Discussion on the 6 mandated areas of the Permanent Forum. And this one is really where you can put almost any issue. You can fit any issue into this item. And this will be covered, I think, over 3 different sessions. So there'll be ample time for people to make their interventions on the floor. It's already been acknowledged that Friday is a closed session of the Permanent Forum, but also be mindful there are other sessions such as Wednesday morning 10 to 1 that are closed or only for Permanent Forum members. In those instances, be sure to check the schedule. There will be, I'm sure, side events taking place during that time. There aren't really many you know, lull periods while you're there, even if the agenda says so. There are always things that you can be attending, side events, and then also somebody else asked in the Q&A, you know, how can they be proactive and how can they amplify their voices further? So this is an opportunity for you to seek out media opportunities as well. There is a media zone usually at the Permanent Forum. And you can also be connecting people through your own organizations or personal social media pages to let them know what's going on at the Permanent Forum and amplify your goals and objectives and your voices in that way as well. So this Friday, the closed meeting, there will be a, there are a lot of things happening for side events, but also there, I know that they're planning for a large Indigenous gathering that includes a concert and music. So that's off-site of the United Nations. So be sure that you're checking the agenda both for on-site, but also off-site. Once again, this is the 2nd largest UN meeting, so it can be difficult to get space for an official side event on site. And be mindful that there are events happening all around the UN and sometimes other places in the city that you can utilize and make connections at. So I am going to go ahead and go back to my slideshow now. And So keep focused on your goal. What are you trying to accomplish with your intervention? This was touched on by Andrea. It's important to be clear and concise. If you have 3 minutes, you do have time to give your thanks or any sort of opening greetings or pleasantries that you would like to add. But if it cuts down to 2 minutes, I would be very mindful to keep it to a little bit of background information and then right to your recommendations. The recommendations are the most important part of your intervention. For some folks, one of their main goals is to just read their intervention on the floor, to have the world hear what their peoples and their communities are going through. And that's okay too. If that's, you need to decide how this time and space is best supporting your goals and your peoples at home. And always keeping in mind how you're going to go back and report to them and show them how your time there was fruitful and how it can possibly benefit the community in the future. It's important that we always keep in the back of our minds who we're accountable to, who we're representing, and who we need to follow up with in our home communities, not just with the forum itself or other UN agencies. So me. I'm just going to go through these next 2 slides a bit quicker to make sure that we have time for Q&A. And excuse me while I check my time. Okay. We talked about this just briefly. Where does it fit in your strategy? That's something that you should decide beforehand. We did just go over the meeting agenda or program of work. I suggest you take some time to really go through that and take some notes and have a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C if you don't make it, say agenda item 5, to be ready to request the floor for agenda item 6 and maybe just tweak your intervention a bit to fit that agenda item. Definitely practice ahead of time to ensure that it is within the time. You don't want to be cut off of the mic. I know we've said this a couple times, but we have to keep hammering it because also before they would cut the mics off, we would see a lot of states, but also others that took over their time of 3 minutes. But we have to be mindful that that's only taking space from other Indigenous peoples from having their say. So it's about having time to get our recommendations forth, but also being respectful to everyone in the room who's traveled quite far to be there and also have their voices heard. So we're going to just get a little bit deeper now. I know Andrea gave some really excellent examples of how forum recommendations can come to life with actual measurable results or actions. So we're going to go through just a bit of an example using Indigenous languages. So this is something that we're used to doing in person, and the in-person training will also have this, but reading through these slides will also help everybody on the call today. And as mentioned before, this is specifically for the permanent forum, but the general principles involved will be beneficial at all UN mechanisms. We're coming out of COVID. Well, we're not coming out of COVID. They have brought us out of a safe zone of a global pandemic, and we're coming back together, and we're trying to rebuild at home first from the ground up. A lot of gaps were really identified in our communities that had to do with our sovereignty, our food sovereignty and food security, and also, having to focus on survival really took attention away from our nations being able to concentrate on language revitalization, food sovereignty initiatives and things like that. So this is an opportunity if your state has failed a bit in their COVID response and your community or your peoples have been impacted by these either change in government policies or removal or reduction of funding programs that were available to you. This is an opportunity to address that. So we're using this as an example. We have a closed Indigenous language school and a state government that had a hand in closing it. So this is an example of a concrete recommendation for the UN Permanent Forum to then include in their final report a recommendation directly to that state or to states to re-implement those programs, to provide additional funding, or to revamp the support that was seen in previous years. So let's think SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. We talked about how you are able to set up meetings with the Permanent Forum, representatives of your government, other UN agencies as well. The Special Rapporteur, there are many. Check out the website of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. You'll be able to see a list of Special Rapporteurs. For example, this one, we might want to engage the Special Rapporteur on rights of Indigenous peoples, as well as Special Rapporteur on education. Is this going to be measurable for your people at home? Of course, always something to keep in mind. Is it achievable? Is your government there representing, as in A, are they occupying space, but also B, are they there in good faith? Do you believe a recommendation from the Permanent Forum would help to address your issue, would help to move them forward in a way that can support your peoples and your communities? Is it relevant to the body itself? We learned what the body can do, but also what the body lacks teeth, as they say, to do. Or is it just outside of their purview or outside of their mandate? Do they not have the actual mandate to be able to follow through? This is the responsibility of us as delegates to learn and understand this. And then time bound, of course, once again, utilize this space and the people in it, and remind yourself that, especially if it's a state government that you're trying to meet with, that you are their constituency, and they do have an obligation to hear from you. So keep that in mind when you're requesting your meeting, and make sure you go in with that confidence in the way that you're requesting, and if so, remind them of their obligations to meet with their constituencies as well. Especially in North America, we always are sure to meet with the highest level, the state departments, and to remind them of their nation-to-nation responsibility in regards to treaties in the US and Canada. So I implore you also to use those techniques that are relevant to your community or your state, or within your state, I should say. A bit of information on the intervention itself. It should have a header, the agenda item, presented by, and the organization. If you can put it on your organization's letterhead, that's even better. You will be submitting this to the forum electronically, as well as in hard copies, and the electronic versions will be collected and be posted by websites such as DOSIP, that catalogs all the interventions made at Indigenous bodies, for example. to some formalities on how to address the body, the chairman, chairwoman in particular, and then make sure that your recommendation is within the 3 minutes, or you either go right into what your recommendation is, or be sure that it's not in the very last minute, because if you happen to go over time, you don't want to take the chance that that will be cut off. We've already talked about this as well. And for the 3-minute and 2-minute interventions, this is really helpful. I mean, this is a diplomatic environment. We come, of course, angry at, some of the state's abuse of power in our communities, or lack of respect for our rights. Or even worse than that, forced extractive industries, for example, on our territories. So we know people are coming in with a lot of grief and sometimes anger and frustration. And we need to find a way to channel that in a diplomatic way so that we are heard by the people that should hear us. Once again, this is the belly of the beast. It is a state-driven process. Although it implies this is an Indigenous body because of the name, at the end of the day, it is the states that drive the United Nations, and we always have to keep that in mind as we decide what types of advocacy we're going to implore and exactly how we execute that. The permanent forum is also a great space to connect with others. It was mentioned that if you hear other interventions that are related to some of the issues you face, that it's a great space to connect with them, exchange contact information. If you have time, have a cup of coffee or even lunch. It's an opportunity to organize and build coalitions and partnerships with other Indigenous peoples that are faced with the same issues that you are, or working on the same topics that you are, that have the same principles and goals and objectives as you. So the permanent forum is still, it's a bit unique in that it's, you sign up in person there, usually the day before your agenda item will open. You will sign up in person inside the room, and you will need to present 10 to 15 copies of your finalized intervention. This is for the interpreters, and it's also for the secretariat of the permanent forum as well. I also suggest that you take a copy for yourself and not try to read from a computer. So many things can happen on your computer. It could freeze, you could run out of juice, you're scrolling, something pops up. Really the most effective way is to read from a piece of paper and keep it away from the mic as referenced before, because you can hear that rattling. But that is really the safest bet for you when you're preparing to read your intervention. In the event you do not see your name on the list for the agenda, speak with the secretariat so they can add you to the list. So it doesn't end after signing up. Make sure you're ensuring that your name is there. And if you do have questions, there is a member of the secretariat at that table in each session for you to ask questions to. So please be sure to utilize them. Your mic will turn red when it's time for you to speak. And when you only have 1 minute left, that mic will start to blink. And then at 1 minute, they will most likely cut your mic. This is something I always have to remind myself not to read too quickly. And the very first intervention that I read, I did just that. I was very nervous. And as mentioned, the web TV, well, I was actually sitting in a place in the room where the web TV screen was right in front of me. So I wasn't prepared for them to call my name or the name of the organization, get ready to read and then just see my face there. Definitely threw me off, and I started to read very quickly because of the nerves. And I was, luckily I still kept on my earpiece because I could hear the interpreters asking me to please slow down. So I was able to sort of, catch my bearings and deliver the second part of my intervention in a way that could be translated. So that's the danger, is reading too quickly will leave out potentially 5 other languages, and all the people in the room that are listening to the language interpretation, they will not hear your words. They will call the name of your organization, most likely not your individual name, although that was submitted. So be ready. You're going to raise your hand as soon as they're calling your name. That way the chair can see you, as well as UNDP will then find you in the room. As you're doing this, we suggest you take 1, 2, 3 deep breaths as you raise your hand. And before you go then to hit the mic, there will be a button on your microphone that will open your mic to the room. And then you will immediately begin your intervention, because as soon as you open that mic, your time has started. So you will start then with "Thank you, Madam Chair," or "Mr. Chair." If your mic happens to be shut down, it's most likely because your time has been exceeded. But also, Andrea touched on this a bit, that the chair of the permanent forum last year, Dario Mejia, he did inform states that in this body, they do not have the right to reply, as they do in other UN mechanisms. So that was, we don't know who is going to be the chair this year. Some chairs do get 2 years in a row, so it's very possible Dario will be elected. But that moderation and chairmanship is, up to them. So just be mindful that if you name a state outright in your intervention, they will at least try to reply to you. And in some cases, they could, cut your mic depending on what action that state is taking behind the scenes. So some unpleasant facts there, but once again, we always need to be reminded of, where we are and where we sit in this process. And we've all heard, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Well, in this case, we're at the table. We're just not eating the same dinner. So just time check. Okay, great. I'm going to go through these. You can read them on your own time. But just reiterating that the training does not end here. We will be there on site to help walk you through all of these things and answer any questions that you may have. I did see a question in the chat about, do you need to go to every session and how you amplify your voices? That's really up to you. Look at the agenda items. If you're there to make connections with others, I do suggest you are sitting in all of the sessions. You learn a lot about other Indigenous struggles, and you're able to find allies in the room and also provide support for those who may need it. So I do suggest going to all the sessions and using media, your own social media, your organization's social media, the media zone, anything you can do to get the message out there. I know we have Indigenous peoples here as well as allies in this space. So I just will also mention the importance to allow Indigenous peoples to speak for themselves in the world arena and also in any media. Allyship is always greatly appreciated, but we definitely want to be sharing our own stories to the world. Okay, so with that, I'm leaving you with another great cohort of Project Access. Miigwech in my language, thank you so much for listening to this presentation. We'll have some time for Q&A now, and I really encourage you to ask any questions you may have. There are no dumb questions here. Everybody is brand new. And everybody continues to learn together, no matter if you've been there 1 year or 10 years. So also keep that in mind. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. Do you want to just take a look at some of the questions that are coming up and maybe take some of them on yourself? You don't need me to do that, so you can just take a quick look and.
Yeah, absolutely. We're getting this a lot about the sharing. So please don't worry. These resources will be made available to you. We'll also share our contact information. So you can email us directly with any specific questions. And we will also send out, there's an online training that you can take as well that has some training modules that will be available through the Project Access and UNDP websites. So we'll share those. There are a number of resources available to you, and we'll make sure that you have those at your disposal. So the recommendations could be phrased as we ask the permanent forum to make the following recommendations to states. Yes, absolutely, states, UN agencies, and the examples that we shared before. I'll use one example in some of the work that I've been doing is around environmental health. Andrea mentioned about pesticides and the pesticide code of conduct. But I work in other UNEP mechanisms, the Minamata Convention on Mercury and the Stockholm, Basel, and Rotterdam conventions on pesticides, persistent organic pollutants, and other harmful chemicals and toxics. So I had to be creative about how can the permanent forum provide a recommendation that I can then take to these other bodies for a few reasons. Number one, we want them to know that some UN bodies, mechanisms, conventions, they tend to work in silos, and they aren't necessarily themselves looking at recommendations that are coming from other bodies. So this is our opportunity to connect those bodies, to get recommendations, to support or further amplify our messages in these other bodies. I won't go too much into this. This is a part of our in-person training. But if you have further questions about how you use permanent forum recommendations and other, especially legally binding treaty bodies, conventions, and other UN processes, please feel free to ask those specific questions. And how can we add our organization to the speakers list? Will it be on site? Yes, it will only be on site. Previously, because it was a hybrid model, you were able to sign up online. However, this is fully in person, so you will need to be there. In previous years, it was the session before or the day before. Your agenda item was meant to make the floor. They will open up the speakers list. So you will see the table of the permanent forum secretariat, and behind them is where they will post each day's speakers list. So you will request one day, you will return to the next session that you will possibly read. And the first thing you should do is go to check that speakers list, ensure your name is on there. And if it's not, make sure it's added, but also making sure that everything is accurate. Are you listed as an umbrella organization? Are you acknowledged as you should be? I see Andrea, please.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to add one thing about the speakers list, just so people won't be dismayed when they're there. Is they'll usually publish a printed speakers list up on the board before the session. The chair does not have to stick with that order. And the chair also will make every effort to spread out the speakers among regions. So say the first 5 speakers are on the list from North America, they may not go in that order. He may then skip to someone from Africa. Plus, the theory of the permanent forum is that there be input from states and UN agencies as well. So they usually try to mix up those, like they'll have an Indigenous speaker, then they'll have UNESCO, then they'll have government of Lithuania, you know, or something like that. So it's frustrating for Indigenous peoples because, especially if you're on the speakers list, but yet you're not being called in that order. That's why I said, don't leave the room for the session, because, you know, you may not be in the exact order. And again, like Rochelle said, and I said, if you're not called, or if you read either one, make sure you highlight your specific recommendation. I usually do yellow highlights and then hand that to a member of the permanent forum from your region, or who you know is interested in your issue, or the chief of the secretariat. There will be election of a rapporteur who will be responsible for drafting the main report. That's an especially important person to, you know, connect with as a member of the permanent forum. Last year it was Tove from government of Greenland, well, represented by Denmark. So that's who will put your language into the report. So I'm just saying that you know, people do get really frustrated in there, because the chair has to give space to states and UN agencies alternating with Indigenous peoples and look for a regional overview. So don't get mad. Get even. What do they say?
I was going to say that. Thank you, Andrea. I see just a couple more questions that I will address or pass on to some of the fellow panelists here. Will there be any president attending? Bolivia will be present. Bolivia is generally there. We don't know ahead of time necessarily who will be part of the state delegations. Yeah, there's not really any way of knowing that concretely unless there are announcements made maybe on your own state websites. Public information about the themes to be addressed at this meeting, those are encompassed in the program of work or schedule of work. And I will put that document in the chat as well, in case you missed that portion earlier when we went over it. I have some questions here about language, and your second language, Aboriginal language, and then your second language is one of the 6 UN languages. Unfortunately, that will not be translated. Your Indigenous languages, they just do not have the capability to do that. One thing you can do when you submit your hard copies of your intervention is write next to your language the translation of what that means, and hope that they will then interpret your words from your language. So that's I mean, I remember, you know, we're just coming off of or are still in, I don't know, but the decade of Indigenous languages. So you know, take this opportunity to speak, to have your languages heard in this space. That's really important. Honor your ancestors in that way, and interpret those words so everybody else can understand them as well. But the most important is really just you know, sharing them with the room. Yes, so all 6 languages, there will be interpretation. You will have headsets there. You'll have a whole little setup when you get into the room. If you are reading, I suggest you get there very early. The room will fill up, and the seats with the mics will fill up. So there are seats behind it, and you wouldn't have access to a microphone. So that seat will have your microphone that you turn on and off, and your 6 buttons for language interpretation. And they'll provide a little headset there for you to find the language that you need. Okay. Sorry if I've missed any questions. I tried to go through the chat and the Q&A, and I'll continue to keep an eye on you know, the written questions and continue from there. With that, I will pass it back to Roberto. Thank you.
Thank you, sister. And thank you for everyone for sticking with us. We've had over 200 people throughout this training. and many of you have continued on. We have a little bit more to go. This next section that we're going to engage in is just going over a homework assignment, really, for those who plan to attend the forum. And we will actually be meeting with some of the people who are on this training session today live in New York for 2 more days. Those will be coming through the UN Voluntary Fund and by other means. But as Rochelle indicated, myself, Rochelle, Andrea, and others from Project Access will be at the forum, and we will be available if you feel that you need some additional understanding or assistance, perhaps somebody to look at your presentation. We will be available, and we would be happy to meet with you and discuss that with you. But I'm going to turn this next part over to Andrea, and she's going to be talking about the homework assignment. So just keep in mind, for everyone who's on again, the idea is that there's a preparation of an intervention, and then that will be reviewed in a live session. But we can be reached out to via email and other methods if you're not going to be at that live session with us right before the forum. So with that, Andrea, thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you. I'll be brief on this section, and then maybe we can have more discussion and questions. The homework assignment, and this is not just for people that are going to be participating in person at the permanent forum or at the Project Access training, even though I will direct this specifically to those that are signed up to attend the Project Access training the Thursday and Friday before the permanent forum. We'll be getting together and thank again our hosts, the UN Development Program, for making the office available there. We're going to be going right in as soon as we get together to a practice session to hear your interventions. And in the past, as I mentioned, we did do joint Project Access interventions through Tribal Link. We're not going to be able to do that this time. So you will need to arrange with whatever organization is actually credentialing you. And that's something really important. You have to sign up to read, and you will be called on to read for the organization that is credentialing you, even if that is not your base home organization. Yesterday was the deadline to sign up for actual participation, and there was a lot of last minute horse trading, even for IITC, for UCTP that maybe had 1 or 2 slots still open to sign up somebody from another organization. They need to know they're reading as, in our case, International Indian Treaty Council, and when you take the floor, if that organization is okay, you could say, in addition, I'm also reading for Assembly First Nations or Enoch Cree Nation or, whatever, Defensa de Maya or whatever is your other organization that is your home base organization. That's very important. You will be called on for the organization that you're reading for. So you need to check with them. It's very important that you utilize this opportunity to develop an intervention anyway, even if you don't think you're going to be able to read it, because as Rochelle mentioned, very important, each organization that has a credential to participate only gets one intervention, 1 3-minute intervention under each agenda item. And for example, we've already had this discussion among our delegation. That first agenda item 5, I think, has both the general recommendation from CEDAW that I mentioned, that was a big victory for us to recognize environmental violence in the actual treaty body general recommendation on rights of Indigenous women, and the decade on Indigenous languages, which is still going on. In fact, I think we're just a couple years into it right now. is on that same agenda item, and we want to talk on both of those. So your choice is use your 3 minutes to talk on both, or pick one and, try to fit our comments on language in another intervention, because it pertains to probably almost everything that we're doing. So those are the kind of choices you make. So here's your homework assignment. Number 1, read last year's report. As Rochelle said, you might want to read even previous reports to see if the issue you're interested in has been already the basis of a recommendation from the permanent forum that you could add on. You could say this hasn't been implemented. For example, they called on UNESCO last year again to implement the international mechanism for repatriation of our sacred items. UNESCO has not done, and I won't swear, anything on that. So I could, if we're taking the floor on that, we could say, thank you for your recommendation. However, we have not had the opportunity to see any results from UNESCO on this item. We hope that, to be able to take that up at this session of the forum, for example. So look at the previous recommendations, and the permanent forum loves to hear if something actually has been implemented or done. I'm going to comment on their call for the repatriation of the Masakova. Sweden did it. In fact, the government of Sweden the next morning was waiting for me outside the room before I went into the permanent forum and says, okay, we're going to do it based on the permanent forum and the expert bodies, addressing this and saying, hey, Sweden, you said you'd do it. Why haven't you done it? So that kind of thing, you can look and see what they've done before. And when you speak to the issue, it's good to recognize that what they've done before and said, and has it been done? Has it not been done? What's the update on it? So read that report. If you have time, at least from last year, read, as Rochelle mentioned, at least maybe the 2 previous reports from there. Look at the program of work. Please study it carefully and see what you want to say, where the issue that is burning for your peoples and nations or organizations can fit in best. And look and see what recommendation, based on previous recommendations, based on current situations, you want to address there. What would be your best outcome for the permanent forum to actually say in their report that will go to the United Nations Committee on Economic, ECOSOC, right? And also to other UN bodies, because the UN bodies will be there. You want them to say something to UNESCO. You want them to say something to UN Food and Agriculture Organization, etc. That's the time to do it. The best way to raise the specific issues that are happening in your peoples is to use the golden words I given before, for example. If it's a for example, the states can't, reply and say you're off the wall by saying what you said. You say, for example, in Guatemala, they're forcibly relocating indigenous peoples' communities to create these so-called protected areas, and that's a violation of Article 26 of the UN Declaration recognizing our land rights. For example, is a real good way to get your issue in there. Or several examples. If you're from a big umbrella organization like IITC, we have a lot of different cases on every single thing we're talking about. So, you can give 2 or 3 examples, as Rochelle said. And therefore, we call upon the permanent forum to include in their recommendations in this year's session, boom, you put what the issue is. They're not going to address a specific human rights case, but they can recommend regarding an issue that then you can use. Talking to the states, I just want to add one thing. Go up to the state that you're from. Don't ask them, hey, do you think you can talk? Say, when is a good time for us to sit down and talk? Maybe have your business card there so they can see you are one of their constituents from their point of view. when would be a good time for us to sit down and talk? And they'll say, what do you want to talk about? And you say, I want to talk about the situation, in this place within the country, that we're working on, or a general situation that you want to talk about. We are going to practice out loud when we all meet, those that are signed up for the Project Access training. We're going to read out loud. Okay, so I really suggest all of you find somebody to read your intervention out loud. I do that. And I've done, I don't know how many interventions at how many UN bodies. I always find somebody that I can read it to and who is timing me and say, okay, great. That's, 2 minutes and 55 seconds. You read at a reasonable pace, and that person will say, hey, you're reading too fast, or hey, you went over 10 seconds. You got to go back and decide what to cut. Reading it out loud also lets you know what the flow is in a lot different way than just reading it on the page. You will need to read it out loud if you're reading in the hall, and you can't really tell how it sounds unless you practice it out loud. And you also can't tell how long it's going to take. You don't want to be cut off. Not only is that embarrassing, but usually we wait till the end to give our final, oomph, our strongest recommendation. You don't want to be cut off. You're going to watch that happen with a lot of people, including states that don't realize that, hey, this means them too. No, nobody gets more time than that, The panelists, sometimes they'll have panels on different situations, or a presentation by the UN Special Rapporteur or President of the MRIP. They probably get more time, but everybody gets the same time. And again, the chair will alternate between an Indigenous speaker, a state speaker, and a UN agency if they're signed up to speak. Please take everything you got here, read the program of work, decide what agenda item you will best be able to present on, and practice it. Write it and present it. I think 3 minutes is, with your introduction, your title, you're going to put UN Permanent Forum, 22nd session, agenda item 6 mandated areas. I don't know what agenda item that is, but for example, intervention by so-and-so from such and such organization. Your next words are what? Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. We don't know which it is yet, but we will at the time. And they'll do that formal stuff. They'll decide ahead of time when they meet, but the formal announcement of who the chair, who the vice chairs, and who that all important rapporteur is, the one that's going to write the report. They'll announce that very first morning. So you'll know, if you're talking about Mr. Chairman or Madam Chairman. And then you go into your statement. You can say, what the issue is, a couple of examples. Therefore, we recommend. You might want to say, we thank the Permanent Forum for their important recommendation from last year. We want to support that recommendation, or we support that recommendation. However, it has not been implemented, or it's been partially implemented, it's in process, etc. So I think that that you have your homework assignment. Read the last year's report. If you have time, previous year's report, at least a couple years back. Read the program of work very carefully and decide what intervention or interventions you want to do in conjunction with whoever is credentialing you. Remember that. It's still important, I think, to draft an intervention, even if you don't think you're going to read it, or you're working with a big organization that already has decided where the statement might want to fit, because it may turn out you'll have a chance to read it, or it can be added to or combined with another intervention from your credentialing organization. Be prepared, those that are going to be at the live training, to read those. So please practice with somebody. Practice yourself. I usually time myself and read it out loud, but find somebody who you read it to. So you're used to reading to an audience, your family, your organization, let them hear you. The more times you read it in advance, the less nervous you'll be, and the smoother it'll go. And also they can critique you. You read too fast, or this sentence repeated itself, you can cut that out. Things like that. They can give you feedback. So help each other like that. And we'll work on those things. I would like you to bring what you would consider a final intervention to the project access training, and be prepared to read it the first morning on Thursday. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrea, for that. And we have been engaging with many of the questions in the Q&A and in the chat. Folks keep asking for recordings, and we've said this a few times during this session. The recordings will be made available. We can also be engaged via our websites or email addresses, and follow up in that way. And we can hopefully continue the discussions on that level. We are actually doing well for our time. I don't see a specific question. Oh, Andrea, you're
I just have one more comment. It is helpful also if the state that you're from, or that was carrying out the violation, actually made progress or acted on. For example, I'm going to thank Sweden, even though I have a hard time doing that, because it took us 19 years to convince them to return our sacred item that they stole from prisoners of war in 1935 or so in Tlaxcala, Mexico, from our Yaqui peoples. However, and they until we engaged the UN system in that, I don't know if I think I made that clear enough. They told us they had no intention in writing of returning the Masakova, our sacred deer head. They said that. Based on everything you've provided, we don't see why we should return the Masakova. They actually said that. It was more than offensive, So it wasn't until we were able to engage the permanent forum and the expert mechanism through discussions on the creation of the new international mechanism for repatriation, but also a direct country engagement that MRIP did, that they, and the last year at the permanent forum, when everybody was talking about it, that they decided they needed to return the Masakova. So I'm going to thank them when we speak on the floor, as an example of a long struggle, but in the end, they did return it to Mexico. It is still in Mexico City, and we're waiting for the right time from our cultural leaders for it to return. It needs to be the right time. So it is in Mexico now. Sweden gave it back. So, if your state actually implemented one of the recommendations of the permanent forum, there's no harm in highlighting that and thanking them for that, and highlighting then the continued work that needs to be done on that issue in that state. For example, a couple of years ago, finally, Mexico, based on a recommendation that we got, in 2015 from the Committee on the Rights of the Child for their country review on Mexico relating to the impact on pesticides of Yaqui children, came out with a declaration that they were going to ban the import of all pesticides that have been banned in the exporting country. And they started with glyphosate, which, they did. That's, the active chemical in Roundup by Monsanto. So they did, ban the import of glyphosate. So, those kinds of incremental advances, it's strategic. It's up to your organization if you want to do that, but it's many times strategic to mention that on the floor, kind of as a, I don't know, incentive to other states to, comply. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrea. Just reminds me of what we often share with many of our participants each year. The United Nations is not the so-called silver bullet that's going to solve all of your problems. It's a place for advocacy. It should be part of your overall strategy, because they are talking about issues that affect our peoples, our nations, our communities. So we need to be there. We need to hear what they're saying, and we need to engage in a way that we can try to reach some positive result for our peoples. But you shouldn't see the permanent forum as the only place to engage. You shouldn't see it as the only part of your strategy. You need to work at the local, national, and international level. This has to be a holistic approach to what you want to achieve. And I think all of our presenters have touched on that in various ways. So we share this information so that, again, if you are going to attend the permanent forum, you attend with a clear idea of the mandate of the forum, what you can do, what you can't do, what it is, what it's not, and you don't go away more frustrated than you need to be. The United Nations can be a frustrating place. Again, it's the home of the states. However, we can, as Andrea just shared, you can achieve results, but it should be part of the strategy, not the only strategy. So just keep that in mind and be realistic. Be realistic with your interventions. What are you asking for them? Is this something that they can really do based on the mandate of the forum or whatever other body you're going to participate in? So with that, I think that's a good segue to our final presentation of this introductory training session. And I want to introduce my dear friend and brother. I believe he's going to be on. I see his name there, Morse Flores from the UN Voluntary Fund. And Morse is going to take you in, or Arturo, are you going to be speaking, or Morse? Because I see Morse's name there.
Oh, sorry, Morse, are you there? If you can take the floor, I'm very happy to give you the floor. If not, I am also ready to present.
All right, well, wonderful. Either Morse or Arturo, both excellent brothers, and will provide great information on the UN Voluntary Fund, because that's our main co-sponsor for this training today. They work with that, and I mentioned the Voluntary Fund and the Fellowship just very briefly in my presentation in the beginning, but they'll go into that a little bit more now. So either Morse or Arturo, whenever you're ready.
Yes, thank you so much, Roberto. I think Morse is having some connectivity problems. So first of all, thank you so much for organizing this training, which I think I'm really impressed of the level of detail. And I think there's been a great participation and really also important contributions from Indigenous people's representatives. Ahora voy a cambiar al español, si me lo permiten, para tener un poco
Now I
de...
will change to Spanish so we can have some diversity in language. And I'd love, as Roberto said, to make up a presentation regarding the contribution fund, voluntary contribution fund of the UN for Indigenous peoples. I believe you can see my screen, right? Yeah. The contribution fund. Can you see my, can you just answer? Can you see my screen?
Okay, I guess yes. Bueno, el fondo de contribuciones
The contribution voluntary fund of Indigenous peoples, it is about, and it follows the mandate to support Indigenous peoples financially so they can participate in different meetings of the UN system. This financial assistance, it's granted to solicitants through established criteria.
Arturo, we just see your email screen. We don't see any PowerPoint.
Give me just 1
Yes.
second. I'm having a technical issue here that I'm going to
Yes,
resolve
no problem. We have
in
a
a
little bit of
second, but
time.
thank you for letting me know. Mm. Can you say it now?
Yes, Arturo, we can see it now.
Great.
And also, I just want to let you know, we have enough time. You know, we know personally, Andrea, Rochelle, and myself, that you also worked with the UN Permitted Forum. So if there's any other, besides sharing this information, if there's any other insights that you feel you want to provide our listeners after your presentations about the forum, they're also welcome. So I just want to put that out there while we do have time left.
Muchas gracias, Roberto. Muchas gracias. Creo que hicieron un excelente.
Thank you very much, Roberto. I think you made a great presentation with a lot of detail. Perhaps I'd love to mention that it might be interesting to say of this session of the forum is that there will be a session regarding participation of indigenous peoples in the UN system. This is part of a process that it's been taken longer than 100 years. This attempt of the indigenous peoples to participate in the League of Nations in that time and after in the UN. And from starting on the World Conference regarding indigenous peoples on 2014, there has been a process initiated to strengthen the participation of indigenous peoples as indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples governments in the UN system, because something that was highlighted by Carmen is the fact that it's an organization of states, but indigenous peoples in this process to this session of the forum has been, they will continue to discuss with the chairman of the National General Assembly, the possibility to strengthen participation of indigenous peoples and governments and institutions as such in a bigger space, larger space of the mechanisms in the UN system. I urge you to take a look at the agenda. There will be a conceptual note, maybe if it's not in the page already, with details to this discussion, and you will be able to
Propuestas sobre cómo fortalecer.
representatives of the indigenous peoples will be able to participate. So there is of how to participate. Beyond this, I'd love to say that the permanent forum, their principal mandate is to work with all the system of agency of the UN, so the agencies in their own work can implement the standards of the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights. And a very important part of the work is the work that has been done regarding the interagency space of indigenous peoples, where there's an effort to launch so all the agencies can adopt policies of their own together with the declaration. These are the only two comments I wanted to say. So if you allow me now, I would like to make a reference to the voluntary fund of the UN. As I was mentioning before, just go to some previous information. This fund is 38 years old, and its aim is to support the participation of representatives of indigenous peoples in the spaces of the UN. Since it started 38 years ago, up to today, over 4,000 indigenous peoples representatives have been benefited from this fund. And this fund, what they do is to bring assistance, supporting the participation paying for the airfare and a small amount of money so the representatives of indigenous peoples are able to participate. This is a page. Our information is also in different languages. For example, for this current forum session, the Voluntary Fund has been able to support 14 indigenous peoples representatives from the different regions so they can participate in the session of the fund. And I must say that part of the idea of organizing this series of trainings, this is the second session that we have been organizing, and we will organize over 10 sessions. And their main is precisely to that for the beneficiaries of the fund, before they go and assist the meetings and the sessions, that they have a better understanding and idea of how the mechanism works, because the UN and the fund, they want for the beneficiaries to be able to participate in an active way. And when they reach New York or the different spaces, they can use the mechanism and not only get to the meeting, assist the meeting, to learn about it. So this is precisely one of the ideas, as I was mentioning before, for the fund. This is just the second training. The first one was regarding the mechanisms on treaties on the UN, and we will continue to through the rest of the year, together with our partners, together with all the people that are here, other trainings regarding subjects and mechanisms that are relevant for indigenous peoples. In relations to the fund, I would like to mention that it supports participation in different mechanisms, UN mechanisms like the permanent forum, the expert mechanism regarding rights of indigenous peoples, the Council of Human Rights, the organ of treaties, the universal periodic assessment, and also the mandate for indigenous peoples to participate in reunions related with the environment and also with the subject of business and human rights, since they are really important issues and relevant for indigenous peoples. As I was mentioning before, there is a meeting of members, and they are integrated by 5 experts of indigenous issues. Most of them are representatives of indigenous peoples, and they work representing themselves in the assessment of applications. You can find the names of the experts that are part
la Junta de Síndicos. Por otro lado, me gustaría mencionar que, bueno,
I would also like to mention that the resource for the fund come from the member states, and we're very grateful with the governments that have supported participation by the part of members of indigenous communities. On our webpage, you can also find request forms for participation in different meetings. We have to update this page, but for the remainder of this year of 2023, on this webpage, you will be able to find our communication call for requests to participate in Indigenous peoples events. This will happen in May and June of this year, 2023. When we review the requests, we use important criteria. Number one, that it's representative of Indigenous peoples or as Indigenous group. And we're also trying to have a regional balance, and also gender balance is important to us. We recognize that Indigenous women are strengthening themselves in certain areas. And so a section of the fund focuses on that, and I think it's great. Here we see that in accordance with the Assembly resolution, the beneficiaries of the fund should be recognized as Indigenous people, as representative of Indigenous peoples. Excuse me. There's selection criteria here on our webpage. Criteria for selection of those that will participate in the forum and with the mechanism of experts and recommendations for the meeting on human rights. And so I invite you to visit the webpage and see here more information about that opportunity. I would like to say that we've had a wonderful experience and seen that many of current Indigenous leaders that are involved in the mechanisms that constitute them, support of Indigenous issues, or the experts, the mechanism of experts, special treaty on Indigenous peoples, and other forums and spaces. In many cases, many of those leaders have benefited from the fund and been productive with it. They have also been able to participate with and learn from the mechanisms. Then this experience, this participation allows them to establish themselves as Indigenous leaders in their local communities at the local level and also regionally, which in turn strengthens their profile and contributes to effective use of the mechanisms themselves. The United Nations, of course, can't write out all of the problems faced by Indigenous peoples, but through the well-use and awareness of these spaces on the part of Indigenous people, it can definitely help to carry out a strategy, enact a strategy that builds changes at the local and national level. As a member of the forum or the secretariat, we've seen how extractivist projects that were slated for development in Indigenous territories have been halted through the actions of representatives of Indigenous peoples. For instance, carrying out a parallel event at the forum that calls the national community, brings international community to know about the situations and realities of an Indigenous community or Indigenous group. So as my colleagues have been mentioning here, all the United Nations doesn't have the teeth that you would want to implement, have its decisions implemented. They're nevertheless very important political spaces that can be utilized by indigenous peoples to advance their interests and the implementation of their rights in accordance with the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights. As we all know, the declaration is critical. Many people question whether it's a binding document or not, but beyond that discussion, just having a strategy, a holistic strategy for the defense of the rights of indigenous people that involves the mechanisms of the United Nations, the regional mechanisms, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the African Court for Human Rights, the European System for Human Rights, the use of media and media outlets, and the alliances that can develop among organizations. I've seen in my own experience as a defender of human rights of indigenous peoples, I've seen that it is possible, it's very possible to carry out change, establish concrete cases of change in communities. And so I will finish by encouraging you to continue your efforts. We know that your time is valuable, but it is worthwhile to continue these struggles so that we have the necessary information on the use of these mechanisms from the Office of Indigenous Peoples and Minorities in the High Commission of Human Rights, UN. We will continue to carry out these training sessions, and we hope that you can continue to participate in them. Thank you very much, Roberto, Carmen, and Rachel, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arturo, for sharing that information, very important, and also to the commitment of the office for continuing to engage indigenous peoples in these type of trainings. We've partnered with I'm talking about Project Access, originally through Tribal Link Foundation, but now as Project Access Indigenous Partnership, along with the International Indian Treaty Council. We've had a partnership with the UN Voluntary Fund for over 15 years doing this type of training, and we look forward to continuing this in all the iterations to come. Folks are also invited to reach out to us in Project Access, as well as with Treaty Council, International Indian Treaty Council, and all the partners for today to follow up on these issues. And with that, we just have a couple of minutes left before our session officially ends. And I want to make sure that first we thank our interpreters for sticking with us for this time. I want to give a special hahom ituno. Thank you, sisters, Andrea Carmen and Rochelle Diver, for the excellent presentations and steadfastness and just continuation of stepping up for our communities over all these years, being at the forefront in many instances, being behind the scenes in many instances. You're appreciated and valued. And to all the partners, thank you for helping to disseminate this information. And myself, as a Taino Indigenous person, it's an honor for me to be here with all of you and to be part of this movement. And now you all who have participated today are part of as we shared, an historic movement to continue to demand the respect and dignity of our rights. Let me just make sure that I thank all those partners again, so that you're aware. One, of course, the UN Voluntary Fund, our Tero, for everything that you've done to help organize this today. Also, Tero, the United Nations Development Program, and Equator Initiative, the Indigenous Peoples Rights International, of course, Cultural Survival, and the International Service for Human Rights. Thank you so much to all of you. And a final thank you to everyone who continued to stay on for this entire training today. We had over 200 people on, and right now, near the close, we're still at about 150 people still remaining. So I think that's pretty successful and evident that people were engaged and listening and want to learn. We will be there at the forum, as we said, and we look forward to meeting you in person and engaging more and strengthening our networks. So with that, I say hahom, ituno kena atia ono. Thank you, sisters, brothers, and relatives.